Uh, in South Carolina, slaves outnumbered the whites, and this was to remain true, folk, up until, well, it might still be true. Mississippi had the same issue later, but Mississippi came later. But in Mississippi, black people outnumbered white. In South Carolina, the same thing, and that's one reason that South Carolina was so strong against giving slaves their freedom, and Mississippi was strong against giving black people the right to vote later. Again, they were outnumbered. All right, now, this period of time in history is known as the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment featured a religious belief called deism. Deism was the belief that yes, there was a God, and yes, he had made the world, but once he made the world, he left it to run itself and very seldom interfered in the affairs of the world. Basically, it was like they compared it to a mechanical clock. You set a mechanical clock in motion, put a clock together, set it in motion, and then leave it there to run itself. Now, of course, if any of you know anything about the clocks of those days, if any of you ever worked with a cuckoo clock, it will not run itself indefinitely. Sooner or later, those pine cones will fall down, and you've got to at least once a day pull them up. Now, do any of you have any idea what I'm talking about? Okay, a few of it, some of you do. Yes, those pine cones fall down. The clocks they had were the mechanical pendulum clocks that depended on a weight, and something about those clocks, you never could get them right. All right, if they were too fast, you pull the pendulum down, it would slow them down. But believe it or not, sometimes you pull the pendulum down, they actually get faster.
Yep.
All right, you can't get them to keep the right time. You have to set them at least every day. If you go 2 days, they get 5 minutes off, then 15 minutes off. You have to set them every day. But anyway, so much for that. But deism, they compared it to the mechanical clock, which they had in those days. Oh, by the way, supposedly if you pulled the pendulum down, it would slow them down. If you push the pendulum up, it would speed it up. But sometimes it seemed to work in reverse. Pull the pendulum down, instead of slowing down, it would actually speed up, or push the pendulum up, and it actually seemed to slow down. You never could get them to keep an accurate time. But anyway, deism. All right, now social mobility. This means that people could move from a lower class to a higher class by accumulating more money. Being in the right place at the right time had a lot to do with it. Hard work also had a lot to do with it. The colonies had more social mobility than you had in Europe. In Europe, you had the established landed gentry, people who were born into their titles, the Duke of this, the Count of that, the Earl of thus. They were born into the noble titles, and they held on to these, even though a lot of noble families became impoverished, and even kings sometimes became poor. But in the colonies, you had the ability, more so than in the old world, the ability to move up or down in the social ladder. Now, France and Spain had colonies. The French had control of Canada, and they had the area around the Mississippi River. Spain had Florida. Spain also had New Mexico and California and the lands from Texas on west, as well as Mexico itself and almost all of Latin America except for Brazil and Jamaica and a few places the French had. But Spain did not get as a lot of its colonials to come to the New World, and neither did France, owing to a serious restriction they had. Neither France nor Spain allowed their Protestants to come in. French Protestants were called Huguenots. I'm not going to write that down, but there are no Huguenots today. They were absorbed by others. Also, the French kicked them out, and they scattered all over Europe and joined other European churches. So there are no Huguenots today. But the Spanish, again, would not allow their Protestants to come over, and neither would the French. They were afraid of what would happen, what had happened to the Americans, that these people would start their own Huguenot colonies or their own Spanish Protestant colonies, and they didn't want that. They wanted everyone in their realm to be Catholic and to remain so. So these nations, France and Spain, often threatened the colonies. In addition, another country was involved, that we'll hear from a little bit later, Russia. Russia went down Alaska and went down to what is today Western Canada, and they started to threaten the Spanish of California. Now the Russians, their claims to the New World were too far away from the colonies to be bothersome to the colonies, but you may or may not know that the reason we have Alaska today, we purchased it from Russia. The Russians got Alaska and claimed it, but then they did not particularly like that icebox. So they sold it, and everybody in America called it Seward's Folly. Seward was the Secretary of State who negotiated the deal. Alaska's proved to have a lot of oil. We don't know how much, and it'd be very mineral rich. Again, so it was a good bargain. 2 cents an acre. Might amount up to a dime an acre by today's standards, but maybe even a quarter or $1 an acre. Really bargain price, so. Anyway, the Russians were to the far west, but they were no threat to the colonies, but Spain and France was. So Great Britain, for this reason, sent troops to protect the colonies. And with all respect, initially these troops were sent over here to protect the colonies. Now they became a real thorn in the colonial side later, because they came over here to fight the colonists. And also the British government said that every colonial home had to be willing to keep troops. That's why we have an amendment to the Constitution that no troops are to be quartered in private homes in peacetime without the consent of the owner. But if you had lived in colonial times, a British officer might knock on your door with about 5 or 6 men and say, okay, you need to keep 2 men in your house, you two. There'd be nothing you do about it. You expect to house these British troops, and you never knew whence they might come knocking and say, hey, you troops, you come out, and they might knock in the middle of the night and tell their 2 troops that they had to come out. Some Indian disturbance that occurred on the frontier, and their services were needed. But anyway, the British kept an army here to protect us from the Indians, from the Spanish, and from the French. Far out west in California and New Mexico, and again, hopefully all of you know California, Texas, and New Mexico are part of America, so we don't want to leave them out. The Spanish still had these places. The Spanish would encounter the Indians, and unfortunately the Indians had no immunity to Spanish diseases. And the many Indians died of two main diseases, smallpox and typhus. And also there was measles. I don't know if any of you are aware, but measles is making national news here today and yesterday too. There's a measles outbreak, I believe, in Oregon, and several young people have caught it, most of them under 10. And they're blaming it on something, folk, that I hope none of you are guilty of, but the reason I'm bringing it up is one of my sisters guilty. Some people do not believe in vaccinating their children. That vaccination is believed to contribute to autism. One of my sisters believed this and pushed this real strongly. I do not subscribe to that at all. Believe me, my children were vaccinated. I've been vaccinated. And when I was in the Army, they gave me a whole bunch of shots that I guess I'm still immune to. I don't know. And including, hey, I got a smallpox vaccination. I got one when I was 6. I still got the scar. But then when I was 30, I got another one. They vaccinated all the troops against smallpox. I mean, well, they shot you so many times or so much that after a while you didn't hardly catch a cold. Even though, unfortunately, I did. I wound up spending some time in a hospital for the one and only time in my life I got pneumonia. The training was hard, and the weather was bad. All right, anyway. And the Indians were forcibly converted to Christianity. Again, this is just simply a matter of fact, folk, not you can each of you know what you think of it. Now, this became a real problem. The king, after King William, began to assert himself more and more into the affairs of the colonists. King William took over around 1680. There was a problem with that. It took 4 months for a ship to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So what if trouble arose in the colonists? They might send a message to the king, Your Majesty, what should we do about this? It would take 4 months for the message to get to the king. Then if even the king if he would reply right away and got it on the first ship out, it would be 8 months before reply came. That is not effective good government. Hardly at all. And this was one, and also, the people in England did not understand colonial life. The people in England did not, they lived on an island. The island had not been invaded since 1066 when William the Conqueror invaded it. So no outsiders. It was true, King William III came in with an army, but King William was invited in, and he did not fight. When he came in, the English king just up and left, King James II. So there really was no military invasion of England from 1066. The people of England did not live in a constant threat of Indian attacks, Spanish attacks, or French attacks, and none of that. Also, in the colonies, the Spanish and the French would sometimes incite and encourage Indians, supply the Indians with guns and gunpowder and even with horses, encouraging them to fight the British colonists. This actually went on. The people of England, though, just didn't understand life in the colonies. And that made governing very, very difficult. All this was obviously to lead to war. All right, now, folk, with that takes us up to chapter 6.